I've been teaching the US EPA asbestos removal classes for over 20 years, which are up to 40-hour classes. I realize that I have a little bit less than 40 hours, so I'll try to condense my story as best I can. About really all I can do is raise a little bit of awareness. Before I start, I do want to do a little bit of recognition. We have a couple representatives from the American Society of Safety Engineers in the back. I've been a member of that organization for some time. I'm an active volunteer, and earlier this year I wrote a position paper on asbestos for the organization, and their Council on Practices and Standards approved it last month. We're bringing it to their full board for approval in June. But we're taking a three-prong approach to asbestos, which is trying to ban existing products from being sold and also dealing with the mining of asbestos, better management and awareness of existing asbestos that we find in buildings today, and then also improve the science on asbestos to provide better protection to workers and also to the general public. So I just wanted to make that little plug. Unfortunately, I'm not here to just talk about that. I'm here to talk about a volunteer effort that I was involved with the Illinois Dunesland Preservation Society. Mr. Paul Kokuris, the president of that organization, is in the back room there. He got me involved with this about almost 8 years ago, and we're talking about Illinois Beach State Park, the most visited state park in Illinois, 11th most visited park in the nation. It's up in the northeast corner of Illinois, covering about 6.5 miles from the Wisconsin border down to the Waukegan shoreline. What we found was this beach was massively contaminated with visible and unbelievable amounts of microscopic asbestos, including some of the more deadly amphibole fibers that you've heard a little bit about before. And so we asked, well, how did this happen? Well, at the very south end of Illinois Beach State Park was a company owned by, I think we heard a little presentation about a gentleman named Johns. Well, he had a company, John Mansville, at the south end of this park that ran from about 1920 to about 1985 producing asbestos materials. You'll see, really there's 3 dots there. The middle of this area where the water is to the left is a John Mansville site. It's an abandoned site now. It's a Superfund site. It's a big environmental cleanup site. And what we have is the green dot to the right. There's actually a discharge that comes out of the contaminated water there on the left into the lake unfiltered on a regular basis. We heard Sean talk about asbestos in water. We were getting readings in the 30 or 40 billion fibers per liter coming out of this on a regular basis, and it still happens to this day. The middle dot represents an area where they had the Pan Am Games in 1959. They had a shooting event where they made a berm out of chunks of asbestos from the Mansville plant, and the city of Waukegan bulldozed it into the lake. The bottom dot there is the output of what John Mansville called was their white ditch, which was massive pollution, asbestos pollution going right into the lake. Now, what we found was asbestos was dumped on the beaches, and a lot of people would say, well, why are you critical of the state and federal government on this? Well, we found that part of the problem was that the US EPA really bungled this Superfund cleanup. It was one of the very first asbestos Superfund cleanups, and they really missed the fact that there was significant contamination just offshore, which was being dredged and dumped on the park beaches. We found the Army Corps of Engineers, along with Commonwealth Edison, were dredging near their shoreline and using this free sand to give to the state. So they were considered potentially responsible parties. John Mansville, again, spewed asbestos into the lake for nearly 60 years. And then the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, who owned the park, actually solicited asbestos, I shouldn't say asbestos, sand to be dumped onto a feeder beach to feed sand to the rest of the shoreline. Now, these responsible parties, we did a Freedom of Information request with the Illinois Attorney General's office, and this is who they identified as the polluters on the beach. Coincidentally, the polluters got to evaluate how dangerous their pollution was and found that it wasn't dangerous by surprise. So what you have here is the red area there is a water intake for a Commonwealth Edison power plant. They take water from Lake Michigan and they cool off their power turbines and they shoot the water back into the lake. And so they pull the contamination that's just offshore into that area. Now, that area is dredged on a regular basis, and it's been found to be massively contaminated with asbestos. We were able to get them to halt dumping this directly on the beaches, and currently Midwest Generation, who owns this, is trying to clean the asbestos out of the sand, which we're a little skeptical about, but we want to see how they're going to do that. They're currently, to this day, still dumping. They won't dump this stuff directly on the beaches, but they're dumping it immediately offshore. Here's a picture up in the beach area where they're dumping this stuff. And so the question is, who's disturbing more asbestos, the people dumping it offshore or the little kid who's digging into the sand up there? Currently, the state picks up asbestos 3 times a week while they step in and out of children building sandcastles, people sunning themselves on the beach. They think that's an acceptable method, while ignoring any microscopic contamination that's been proven there. There's a feeder beach at the north end of the park where hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of this contaminated sand was dumped. You can see where the red line is. It shows that that feeder beach is doing its job. It's feeding sand to the 6.5 miles to the south. That's about a 20-foot high area. After about 99% of this had eroded away, the state came in and cleaned up the rest and said there's no more asbestos problem. And we asked them, what about the other 99% that spread down the beach? They said, don't worry about it. We'll pick up the big pieces as they come around. So we've always been concerned about the microscopic asbestos. Paul Koukouris, sitting in the back there, president of the Illinois Dunesland Preservation Society, took me through some of the areas of the park. There used to be former homes there that were razed, and they left the asbestos debris just spewed into an area. So we got the local media involved with that. Unfortunately, every spring they burn these areas, and they say that's an advantage because it helps them see the asbestos that's oozing up out of the ground a little bit easier. They will not put up signs, they will not put up fences to keep people out of this area, and there's bike trails, there's hikers that go through these areas on a regular basis. So downplaying the risk, this park was closed in 1997 because there was so much asbestos washing up the beaches they couldn't hide it anymore. They cleaned the beach, and they basically said it was safe because the sand contained less than 0.5% asbestos, which has not been considered protective of health. They also did some air sampling in March when the ground was frozen and it was snowing out, and they said there was no asbestos in the air, so bring your families to this particular beach. I got involved and criticized this report. It forced the state of Illinois to relook at this. They had the University of Illinois at Chicago come out and do a study. They compared Illinois Beach to other beaches like Chicago's beach, and unfortunately they found Chicago's beach had the most highest concentrations of asbestos. Some of you may be familiar with tremolite asbestos, the same asbestos they found at Libby, Montana. They found very high concentrations of this on Chicago's beaches. What did the University of Illinois do with this study? They removed that data from their final report, saying that it skewed their results. It wasn't a good background. So we're very, very concerned about that. They did a study. Chicago was forced to do a study. They hired the same consultant who works for John Mansville up in Waukegan to do this study. They set up 4 air samples. You might be able to see 4 little dots there. And those red lines are 100 feet away. They had 4 air sample pumps running. 2 of them were downwind, and the ones that were downwind from the activities were over 100 feet away. So they came out on a nice windy, wet day, had somebody lay on a blanket and play catch with ball, and they said, there's no asbestos problem here. It's okay for people to come in. Unfortunately, they have pro volleyball events here, and we think this disrupts the sand just a little bit more than somebody laying on a blanket reading a book. Plus, when you're only monitoring one person compared to we're probably having tens of thousands of individual disturbances going on at once. This is a very, very big problem, and it's something that these government agencies don't look at when they're evaluating risk. They look at one person, one exposure. They don't combine it by the multiple types of exposures. Luckily, I'm not in Atlanta right now in CDC's backyard, but the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, which is under the Centers for Disease Control, does a lot of asbestos studies. They came out and did a study at Illinois Beach State Park. We wanted to come out on a nice, sunny, hot day. You can tell by the guy on the right. First of all, he's not wearing any protective equipment, but he's wearing a winter coat because it was freezing cold out, and it was actually raining when the event occurred. And when the newspaper asked them, why are you taking tests when it's raining, they said, well, water doesn't affect the dust and the fibers in this area. Don't worry about it. What was more disturbing, and I have video of this, is that tractor there is pulling it's grooming the beach. It's pulling a chain link fence to smooth the beach out, and they have air pumps on the back of it. The person driving that tractor has full protective equipment on and respirators. The general public is in the area where they're creating this disturbance. The disturbance was so high they banned the state from doing this, and I filed an ethics complaint against the member from the Center for Disease Control who ran this study. And after a year, Health and Human Services got back to me and said, well, our people would never do this, even though I had video recordings of them actually doing this stuff. So what are some of the problems? The US EPA and the Center for Disease Control have a combined group they call their TRW review group that looks at asbestos issues. They also have an emergency response team that does a lot of evaluations. And what we found out was The people from the EPA do the studies. The people from ATSDR, or this Agency for the Center for Disease Control, review the work, and then they switch their hats and put on a TRW hat, and then they peer review their own work. And you know what they find? They do an excellent job. We didn't think that was a very honest or independent way to look at a lot of the data, particularly when we challenged a lot of the problems. What's some of the different things we found? When they take air samples, they used larger filter sizes than were allowed by the protocols. Now, if anybody's gone fishing, if you use a fish net with fine holes on it, you're going to catch a lot more stuff than if you have bigger. And so we were challenging some of the switches that they were doing. They avoided a lot of the aggressive type of tests where people would really generate a lot of disturbances. And they were detecting asbestos in the air, amphibole asbestos in the air, when they simulated children building sandcastles. They didn't see a problem with that. Their latest study, the EPA came out in 2007, hastily did a report after beach season was over again. We were very, very disappointed with that. What we found is they started making modifications to their initial protocols, which were actually modifications of other protocols, and so what you have is a report that has modifications to modifications to modifications, and they say this is really good science that we're doing out here. This 2007 study is still under peer review. They refuse to release this report because they know we're looking at it and we're going to challenge them on it. But it's been almost 3 years and they will not finalize this report. Yet every year, 2 million visitors go to this beach. Tens of millions visit all the way along the entire Illinois Lake Michigan shoreline, and nobody is aware of the asbestos issues, the contamination issues that are there. I had the honor last year in March to be invited to a congressional investigative subcommittee hearing. What I found out was a lot of the claims I had made against this Center for Disease Control Agency, others had made about these agencies as well, and they said, will you come to Congress and tell your story? And when I was in the green room waiting to go on, what really surprised me was I thought everybody was there to talk about asbestos, and there was somebody there that was there to talk about the FEMA trailers. Some of you remember when the hurricanes hit in the south, they got all these trailers from FEMA for people to live in, and they were off-gassing formaldehyde, and they found that this agency, ATSDR, had rigged the studies to say it was safe just so people could live in them. But there were scientists from all around the country showing from 1991 to present that it's not just asbestos, but it's water contamination, ground contamination, air contamination, that this agency has, as they say, jacklegged the studies. They falsified data on behalf of the EPA saying things were safe. I was flabbergasted by a lot of that information. So what needs to be done here? We need some more ethics here. I mean, we can say that, coming from Illinois and speaking about ethics, you might say, where are you coming from with that? But we need ethics all over the place. We certainly need it in science. We need more open transparency. We certainly need independent peer review on a lot of the stuff that's going on. For our beaches, can you please test in the summer months when it's not raining? We don't want off-season times when it's raining and it's cold and it's snowing out. Looking at multiple exposures as opposed to just these little isolated single exposures. But really communicate the uncertainties. There's a lot of uncertainty with asbestos, and so what they say is, well, there's not enough information to make a decision, so let people in here. And I think we need to be more proactive. We actually need to be a lot more precautionary with asbestos, and I think a lot of you would agree with me that until we really establish how and when asbestos becomes toxic, we certainly shouldn't have little kids digging sandcastles in this stuff. I think that has me on time. We have some information here. I do want to point out we have a little website called asbestosbeach.com, which has information, and also the IllinoisDunesland.org has a significant, probably 10 years worth of data on there. So if you are interested in this and you want more information, please check out those websites or talk to me offline. But thank you very much.